A very good morning and welcome to the 34th meeting of the Criminal Justice Committee in 2025. We have no apologies this morning. Fulton McGregor will be joining us presently, and we're also joined this morning by Pam Gosel, MSP. So our first item of business today is to start our evidence taking on the Prevention of Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill. So that should be continue our evidence taking on the bill. So we have one panel of witnesses today, and I intend to allow up to 90 minutes for this panel, and I refer members to papers 1 and 2. So this morning, I welcome to the meeting Dr Emma Forbes, National Lead for Domestic Abuse, Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, Professor Liz Gilchrist, Criminal Law Committee, the Law Society of Scotland, Detective Superintendent Adam Brown from Police Scotland, and Glyn Lloyd, Chief Social Work Officer and Head of Children's and Community Justice Services with Dundee City Council, and Chair of the Justice Standing Committee with Social Work Scotland. So, warm welcome to you all, and thank you very much for the written submissions that you've provided us with. So, just before we start, as usual, can I remind members and our witnesses to be succinct in your questions and answers, and maybe remind members they can select specific witnesses to respond to a question, and that will help allow us get through as many questions and responses as possible. So, if I can maybe open up with a question relating to part 1 of the bill, which is notification requirements and monitoring under MAPA. And I'll maybe come to Dr Forbes first, and then I'll work along the panel, and I'll bring in Professor Gilchrist, Detective Superintendent Brown, and then Glyn Lloyd. So I wonder if you could set out the role of your organisation in the current multi-agency approach to domestic abuse. So, for example, the use of MATAC, the disclosure scheme for domestic abuse. And in your view, does the current approach work? Could it be improved? And do the provisions of this bill improve or add to the current approach? Now, I know, Professor Gilchrist, you may be coming at this more from a sort of philosophical perspective, but in terms of the question, I'll just come to Dr Forbes to open up.
Good morning, Convener.
Good morning.
So Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service doesn't sit on the MARAC, and as the sole prosecuting authority in Scotland, really by default, we are dealing with cases once they've been reported, but we're recognising that not all offending is reported to us. So we have very close working relationships with our colleagues across the justice sector and the third sector, and the MARAC meetings and the information that we get from those meetings about risk and the work that goes on around the criminal justice system rather than within it is fundamental to our ability to do our job as prosecutors. So if we receive a report for a contravention of Section 38, for example, so in common language, a breach of the peace, and that's aggravated because it's by being within a domestic relationship, then if we receive a report, one charge, breach of the peace, and somebody is maybe 3 on the risk indicator that the police have carried out, the domestic abuse questionnaire, has never been to a MARAC, and there are there's nothing on the vulnerable persons database, that's a very different case than the case that's reported to us of a single one charge, Section 38, where the person is 15 high risk, has been to the MARAC, and we know that there is a coordinated intervention to manage that person's safety. So in terms of our presentation to the court on risk, in terms of what protective measures we might be seeking, in terms of prioritisation, everything that we're able to do to robustly and effectively prosecute, then the MARAC provisions are really important. I think it's worth saying we're here today to talk about prevention of domestic abuse, and we work very closely with Scottish Government colleagues and colleagues across the sector in the implementation of Equally Safe strategy. We support that and all of the work involved in that. Prevention is one part of the equally safe work in terms of eradicating violence against women and girls. This is recognised as broadly gendered offending, although it can affect anyone. The language in the Equally Safe strategy is borrowed from the Istanbul Convention. It's fitting that we're here today to discuss this during 16 Days of Activism. The Istanbul Convention talk about pillars, and I think it's important when we're having this discussion today about prevention that we see prevention as one pillar, because that can't stand up on its own, and one of the other pillars is prosecution, and another is coordinated policies. So that's why it's so important that we have a joint protocol with the police, that we work, you know, with our partners, and that we effectively prosecute, because in terms of prevention, it's very hard to eradicate domestic abuse so it doesn't happen in the first place. But because that would involve a society where everybody was equal and there was no inequality. We don't have that. Okay. But we can intervene to prevent further offending, and that's what we try to do. So through prosecution.
So can I maybe sort of just pull your response back to the bill and your views on, so having outlined that, then in particular in relation to the notification requirement provision in the bill, what your comments are on that from you, the Crown Office perspective?
So anything that works to prevent domestic abuse is a good thing. My concern is that the provision in Part 1 of the bill to create a register, I don't feel that there's an evidence base to show that that will prevent domestic abuse. Okay. I'm concerned that although it's well-intentioned, that there might be unintended consequences from that in relation to the safety of those reporting. And evidence from England and Wales has suggested that it's extremely expensive to implement. It's unlikely to do very much to improve the safety of women and girls, and detracts crucial funding from elsewhere within an already effective landscape.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Professor Gilchrist.
Talking on behalf of the Criminal Law Committee, then I don't think that there would be any response. Actually, we would remain neutral. If I'm permitted to talk as a forensic psychologist and risk assessor in domestic abuse who's running trials across justice at the moment of interventions, then I'd be saying that MAPA and MARAC are incredibly important, and the monitoring the right to ask, right to tell, the equivalent of Clare's Law, is really, really important, so that high-risk victims can be told of the risks appropriately in terms of disclosure, so that the police have got the tools to monitor and manage risk, and that we can engage in appropriate safety planning with victims. The register, the additional of a register, I am not sure if it is going to achieve the purposes it's set out to do. I think the Law Society and myself personally and all colleagues are absolutely in favour of trying to do everything to identify, support and manage the risk of those perpetrating the offences. I would be concerned that we might have a broad definition of domestic abuse, and I think the Criminal Law Committee have identified that as well, and that would make it a really, really wide-reaching the impact as it would actually gather up for too many cases. And from the sex offender register in England, what they are finding is that as the longer the register goes on, the wider the remit is, the more people they're trying to manage at a really high level. And actually that it's disproportionately sort of focusing on the lower level risk rather than the highest level risk. So to me, there's something about focusing the registration and the additional kind of protections that might come from this on the right people, so at the highest possible level. Now, whether that adds to the MAPA level 3s, I'm not sure, but I mean, I wouldn't be averse to it. I think the Law Society are really positive about the support, but the question mark is about the practicalities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Detective Superintendent Brown.
Morning, Convener, and thank you. So in answer to the first part of your question, the police obviously have a very prominent role in all of those processes that you reference. We're responsible for the administration, the delivery, the convening of meetings around our disclosure scheme, and of course it's the police who have to deliver the disclosures themselves We're prominent in every MARAC across Scotland, so we attend in every area. Whilst there are different iterations of how MARAC is structured and administered and chaired across Scotland, we're present in all of them. And our role within that is to gather information, share information at those meetings, and then collaborate with other agencies around actions that can be taken away to improve the safety of the victims that are being discussed. MATAC is a police-led process whereby high-risk perpetrators are identified, often by the police, but not exclusively by the police. These could be serial perpetrators, or it could be just that their particular conduct is of high risk. Following a similar multi-agency discussion, again, actions can be taken away by agencies, but the principal action for the police is that we would normally take a large-scale investigation away into that perpetrator, looking at previous partners, previous offending, and any other interventions we can implement to intervene in their conduct and reduce risk. In answer to the second part of your question, overall, we're not supportive of Part 1 of the bill. As everyone else, we absolutely recognise the intentions behind it, and any opportunity to talk about potential interventions in domestic abuse is always welcome. But we have concerns about how the management of domestic abuse offenders, in this way on a statutory basis may draw our focus and resources away from some of these other processes. We're not involved in these other processes because we have to be. We're involved in them because we believe that they're the right thing to do. A key difference between these processes and the proposals in Part 1 is that these other processes don't require a criminal conviction for interventions to take place. Criminal convictions are, of course, taken into account, but they don't necessarily illustrate the totality of risk that's posed by a perpetrator. I see a risk of Part 1 is that our resources, time and attention will be diverted unavoidably into the management of perpetrators who don't necessarily pose the highest risk. Basically, we'll end up doing what we're obliged to do rather than what we should be doing. Of course, people who are convicted of the most serious violent offences, including sexual violence at this point, can and already are managed in this way under existing legislation. Even if sufficient resources existed, and I'm happy to touch on resources, it's unclear how Part 1 would fit in with these other processes without creating multiple forums across agencies with an overlap of responsibilities and duplication of effort around their administration and delivery. To my knowledge, no detailed analysis of this has been completed. These structures that exist around MARAC, MATAC and our disclosure scheme are complex. They've been established over time, and I'm not sure what the impact would be on that established but complex network of professional relationships that exist across Scotland currently to make them work.
Okay, thank you. And I think the issue around the resources and the implications was certainly brought out in your submission, so thank you for that. And Glyn Lloyd.
Good morning, Convener. And from a justice social work perspective then, obviously we're one of the responsible authorities under MAPA arrangements, so key in terms of current risk assessment, risk management of category 1 to 3 offenders. Specifically at the moment in relation to domestic abuse perpetrators, we prepare court reports to assist the court in making sentence decisions, and we deliver programmes, or I should say programme, in terms of the accredited Caledonian programme in the community to a small number of domestic abuse perpetrators. So a key part of MAPA, MARAC, MATAC and also child protection arrangements as well, I think is important to emphasise, given that around about 50% of children subject to the child protection register are there because of domestic abuse within the family. Some of the concerns we have are the high attrition rate between the number of incidents and the number and type of programmes delivered. So as an example of that, for instance, in Dundee, in any given year, between 2,500 and 3,000 domestic abuse incidents, between 350 and 400 court reports with a domestic abuse marker, and only 59 community payback orders with the Caledonia programme. So there's a fallout from the number of domestic abuse incidents through to court reports with the domestic abuse marker and the number of Caledonia programmes. That's a concern. Another concern is the availability of programmes. So until recently, for instance, the Caledonia programme was delivered to different degrees across different local authorities, and it's the only accredited programme available to domestic abuse perpetrators, and specific criteria need to be met in order to access that programme. We also have concerns about the growing number of young people who are beginning to display inappropriate attitudes and behaviours in their relationships with each other, and concerns as well in the context of the bill about the availability of victim data and how that can be used, for instance, to inform longer-term planning, longer-term support to victims. So we think that the bill is helpful. We understand the principles behind the bill and what it's trying to achieve, but that comes with some caveats and some implications. In terms of the notification requirements, we have reservations over whether or not that should be mandatory, even if it is restricted to the cohort that it currently outlines. There's an argument perhaps that should be discretionary, with a focus just on higher risk perpetrators to enable the better management and targeting of resources. Concerns as well about the availability of programmes, both in relation to Caledonian and other programmes where people don't meet the criteria. Education, we think, is helpful, but that needs to be delivered in the context of GERFEC and Team Around the Child arrangements. And in terms of MAPA, obviously we do have the 3 categories, but if a domestic abuse perpetrator is perhaps assessed as high or very high risk, they could fall in to the category of category 2 for violent offenders at the moment. So overall supportive in principle, but as we say, some concerns about some of those issues in terms of the implications.
Okay, thank you very much. Quite a bit for us to think about there, so I won't ask any follow-up questions at the moment. Probably we'll come back in though during the session. I don't know if Sharon Dowie, do you want to come in on this particular line of questioning at the moment, and then I'll bring in Liam Kerr.
It's basically come back to section 1 for the report, and it's just because there's kind of differing opinions there. So for COPs, you've put in that the people that will be on the register will have 12 months or more in prison or a community payback order, and you've put that it's potentially confusing and inconsistent with the importance placed by the criminal justice agencies and third sector organisations in Scotland of a consistent definition of domestic abuse. But I was just like, would this not mean that if somebody is put on the register, it would become a deterrent to somebody who has got a lesser charge? It's maybe a first offender. So you've said that you wanted more people to be involved, but that would maybe lead to more bureaucracy, whereas the bill is intended as just for high-level offenders. When it gets to the Law Society, you've said that they consider the proposed provisions in Part 1 could create a real risk of labelling people as inherently dangerous. And you've said that, in your view, a higher threshold for registration would produce a more meaningful register. So do you think that the bill as it stands should be a higher risk level going onto the register as opposed to the way it is just now? And for Police Scotland, just get to the page. You've said in review of Part 1 of the bill, we're not of the opinion that the significant investment of budget and resources needed to meet its requirements are proportionate. So if you had the resources required, do you think that this would fill a gap that we currently have in the system? And if you had the resources, would you be more supportive of the bill? So I don't know.
I don't think that investment of budget and resources is going to be proportionate to the any potential benefits. So we'll have to acknowledge that it's untested ground. It's not really been replicated. There's no other jurisdictions that we can refer to really that are adopting this specific model. But I'm not seeing any evidence in terms of the potential benefits of this type of management of offenders that will be proportionate to that sort of investment of our efforts and resources. And that's not to refute that there aren't any potential benefits. There may well be potential benefits. So one that seems to come up fairly frequently, and we would maybe echo ourselves, is that it may lead us in some way to recognise that someone's in a new relationship and offer an opportunity to deliver disclosure to that person. But we absolutely cannot extract any data that will inform us how frequently that would happen, how often offenders would comply with requirements to advise us of a change of circumstances. So it's very, very hard to gauge the extent of any potential benefits, but the investment would be significant.
But if you had more detail on how it would fit in with the current structures, do you think it could be beneficial?
I think I'd need that detail to
You'd
answer
need the
that question. Taking Marac as an example, and my own experiences chairing Marac here, in terms of overlaying those MAPA type structures onto Marac, and when I say here, I mean here in Edinburgh, there would be complexities here. But in Edinburgh, we've got the comparative benefit of we deal with one local authority, one health board, and relatively on hand, a network locally of women's aid groups and other support agencies that can contribute. If you go a few miles away to Dalkeith, which sits in another single policing division, which we call J Division, that's a single policing division that deals with 4 local authorities, 2 health boards, and a different network of support agencies. So it's not enough to just say that this will overlay with Marac and complement it. Detailed analysis of how that will impact on things like Marac across Scotland in all our communities is essential before we can really answer that question. And I think, for me, that's a fundamental question.
Okay, thank you. Professor Gilchrist.
Yeah, well, I think the Criminal Law Committee are suggesting that it should be a higher threshold if we were going to have a register, primarily to focus resources. I think there's a couple of things also. One of the deterrents would be that it might in fact stop people pleading guilty. The idea of being on a register, so that broad inclusive category, might actually put people off pleading guilty, so lead to more court time rather than saving court time. And I think, separate to the Law Committee, myself as a forensic psychologist, what I would say is, if we thought that the consequences of people's behaviours would stop them, so the idea that they might be on a register would stop them at the time of the offending, then I might be more in favour of it, but I'm not sure that that's true. And the one thing we do know about domestic abuse is that these are people who tend to breach orders to manage their risk and safety. So I'm not sure that that will pose a deterrent at that point. One of the things I would want to draw the committee's attention to, though, is there's current pilots at the moment south of the border in terms of DAPOs and DAPNs. So the domestic abuse protection notices and domestic abuse protection orders, where they're going to make orders with a condition for treatment. But it's at a pilot stage. So I think we're in a position where we don't really know whether or not those pilots of protection orders with a requirement to do something that might stop earlier than those more serious convictions might be of help.
Right. So see if it's those that are, you're actually wanting a higher threshold, so if it's those that have done such a serious offence, would there not be more evidence there? So even if they're not pleading guilty in advance, then there would be more evidence there to say that they would actually get a
well, I don't think it would prevent the prosecution and conviction of people at the high end. What I do think it is the people at the lower end, where we are looking at more difficult evidence, perhaps, where there isn't physical injury, where we're looking at coercive control, where we're looking at individuals giving evidence and it's like 2 people, parties, limited witnesses. I think at that point there are people who would plead guilty, but they maybe wouldn't plead guilty if they are then also going to end up being put on a register. Right. And that being, and we're unclear about how long that would be for, etc. I mean, I think there's also maybe a lack of clarity around who would be sharing that information. And at the moment, this is my personal opinion rather than the opinion of the Criminal Law Committee, we have a lot of multi-agency work, and that working effectively with the police, the fiscal, etc., and the victim support agencies, education, social work, I think making that work well is probably the best thing that we can do and invest resources in. I'm not against a register, and I don't think anyone is. It's just the practicalities of how that might work and the resources.
Okay, so it's finding out more detail about how it's going to work then.
And thinking of the unintended consequences as well.
Okay, thank you. Dr Forbes. Hi.
So we know that there's a range of people who commit domestic abuse, and many of them are also involved in other offending, and a significant amount of them will breach court orders, as we know. But within that, there's quite a lot of research to show that there's a power few. And so by that I mean that, so for example, one study in Suffolk Constabulary showed that they analysed 36,000 domestic abuse cases, and they found that 80% of the harm was perpetrated by 2% of the perpetrators. So similarly in Thames Valley in 2017, they found that 90% of offending was perpetrated by 3% of perpetrators. So we know that there's a very small number of abusers, the thin end of the wedge, who are committing the most pernicious and dangerous domestic abuse and causing the most amount of harm. And those, that 2%, that 3%, that's who we want to target. And I don't see the evidence that the register is targeting them. Now, many of our highest risk offenders will be convicted of an offence that leads to a custodial or a community payback order as an outcome. But we also know that many people will report and give a partial disclosure. Many don't even feel like they can come forward and report. And so the beauty of the MARAC and MAPA and MATAC structure that we have at the moment, with the three of them orbiting each other and the same multi-agency teams, is that we are able to identify those victims most at risk and those most at risk of perpetrating further abuse and try to dismantle that. And I don't feel that the register is going to do that, and would also worry that the stigma of a register would prevent people from pleading guilty, which just prolongs the justice journey for victims and compounds re-traumatisation through the process and makes it harder for us to engage those victims and to bring cases to court.
So do you think the register should only have the top 3% of offenders in it, or do you think it should be opened up to more people? I thought that's what the evidence kind of suggested, that you wanted more people in the register.
So we're just. So our position is that we don't consider that the register we don't consider that at the moment there's an evidence base that the register is going to add value, and they're concerned about unintended consequences. The part of the evidence that you're referring to, and sorry if that wasn't clear, was to try to show that it was. We felt that the way that the categories had been selected was inconsistent, and that there wasn't a clear rationale as to why it was those categories and not others.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
Yeah,
sorry.
thank you.
Okay.
Polly McNeill, do you want to come in on a supplementary, and then I will bring in, if it's on this particular issue.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, it is. Good morning. Yes, I was interested in the submissions of the Law Society and the Crown Office, just about the point that you addressed to Jan Dowie about it may result in less guilty pleas. And in the Crown Office submission, you go on to say more victims being required to give evidence at trial, and an increase in disputes within the trial about sensitive information, such as the precise nature of the parties' relationship. I just thought it was a particularly important part of the submission that Crown Office and the Law Society made on that point. I just wondered if you wanted to elaborate more on why it would be less likely to plead guilty, and this issue about disputes within the trial about sensitive information, such as the precise nature of the parties' relationship.
By that, at the moment, we have two ways of prosecuting domestic abuse, roughly. One is a contravention of Section 1 of the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act, which is a single offence of a course of conduct. And separately, we can add a domestic abuse aggravation to any common law charge where it has been committed, or we believe it's been committed within the context of a relationship between partners and ex-partners. Now, our concern is that there might be more defence contest of that aggravation and the fact that they were in a relationship, if it's perhaps a new relationship parties haven't known each other for a very long time. We're concerned that there might be more challenges of that aggravation if the consequences, that if the person's convicted with the aggravation, it will lead to being added to the register, which we know that being on the Sexual Offences Register, which is the only register we have as a frame of reference, has significant consequences for an individual. And we know that the courts think very seriously before imposing that, and that it does have an impact.
And just so I've understood that particular point, the accused is less likely to plead guilty if they're going onto the register. Is that
we don't know, but that's just one of the things that we would raise as a concern. So we don't really have much of an evidence base as to whether or not this will work, except that, well, the report that the member who brought the bill referenced in the financial memorandum, the Essex report, and that was referenced to show the costing of this. That report has done a quite significant study in England and Wales that showed that the register will do little to help victims, and London's Victims Commissioner said that the research showed that proposals for a domestic abuse register would not significantly improve the management of perpetrators due to limitations of focusing on a small cohort of convicted offenders. So that's the only evidence really that we have to go on. We don't really know in Scotland, so these are hypotheticals in our evidence, but those were just our concerns based on our experience of prosecuting a broader range of offending.
Thank you. Is there anything for the Law Society? Anne, is it on the same point?
I think I would be saying very similar, that there's just that people tend to plead guilty on the basis that they may have a reduction in sentence, and some of that will be a reduction in monitoring. If that reduction in monitoring isn't going to go away because they will be on monitoring, then I think the incentive for the plead guilties goes. There is evidence, some evidence from England, that you lose monitoring as well, that people change their names, they go underground and they seek to avoid the registration. So they're technically monitored, but they're not actually able to be followed up. And I think I would have even more concerns that we make it harder for the more manipulative offenders to be tracked and traced by having that register.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Liam Kerr, followed by Katie Clark.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'll address my first question to the Law Society and the Crown Office. And for good order, I remind colleagues that I am a practicing lawyer and I'm regulated by the Law Society of Scotland. Dr. Forbes, then first, it's clearly important at stage 2, if this bill gets to that stage, that we tighten all definitions and make it as good as it can be, such that it achieves its aims. Now, the Crown Office in its evidence commented on the definition of a domestic abuse offender, and the Law Society made a similar point about the definition of offences involving domestic abuse. So, Dr. Forbes, first, what is your concern about that definition? But perhaps more importantly, how might this committee look to tighten that through amendments to make the bill do what it intends?
I think I've given evidence to this committee before about the importance of having a single definition and understanding of domestic abuse. We have the gold standard in Scotland. Research has just come out in England and Wales to show that their broad definition that involves family violence and lacks focus of the relationship between partners and ex-partners and that unique dynamic, and as a result is leading to less focused interventions and prevention. So it is important that we protect the definition of domestic abuse that we have in Scotland, because so far we have found it effective. I think that the issue with the bill is that it's, as my friend has mentioned in evidence already, it's not discretionary on the court. It's mandatory that to impose a sentence where somebody's added to the register for certain offences, rather than saying that this will apply to... I think my concern is that it's categorising by the offending that we manage to prove in court beyond reasonable doubt, which does not reflect the totality of someone's lived experience of abuse and doesn't reflect our understanding of domestic abuse or where the most high-risk offenders are. And I think that's just the fundamental sticking point, is that we don't know enough about the effectiveness of a register to be able to really get into the whys and wherefores of how we might improve what's here, because that is predicated on the assumption that it's going to work, and I'm not convinced that it is.
Right, but just to be clear, so in terms of the definition of a domestic abuse offender, your evidence is similar to that which you gave this committee previously, which is that it needs to align more closely with what's already on the statute book.
Yes, yes, please.
I understand. Professor Gilchrist, same question then. You talked about the definition of an offence involving domestic abuse. Can you tell us your thoughts on that?
And I will premise this on the basis that whilst I'm sitting representing the Criminal Law Committee, I'm not a lawyer. Okay, so I'm a forensic psychologist with some experience of law. In terms of the Criminal Law Committee, what we're saying is that the definition doesn't include, at the moment, all the offences that would be against ex-partners. And it needs to, so for the purposes of not being misleading. So I think there's a broader definition needed to be included so that we actually define domestic abuse as all the offences, which might include things like drink drive. It might include all sorts of other things that would have a DV flag but wouldn't come under this definition. However, in saying that, that would then create a really broad definition of domestic abuse and then a really broad registration. My personal view is, in order to address that, you would have to bring in a risk assessment so that you would be focusing on that broad definition and narrowing it down on the basis of those who pose a highest risk, who have been convicted of offences of domestic abuse on that general definition. But that's a personal view. The Law Society basically suggested we were having a two-tier system where we'd have some people with an offence that hit the level up and they would be on the register, and those who were variable risk and didn't hit the definition not being registered. So we actually end up with some people who've committed offences against partners not being registered and some people being registered, which in fact could be misleading to new partners, employers, etc. So the two-tier system would be a problem.
Thank you. Glyn Lloyd, you appeared to be signalling your agreement with some of the remarks of Professor Gilchrist there. So I'll come to you now. In Social Work Scotland's submission, it's been highlighted that one positive amendment that this committee might consider would be to include a notification requirement on a change of partner relationship. But the submission also highlights that many families remain together following a conviction, such that additional requirements might lead to retaliatory action. If that's right, first of all, isn't there a risk that this Parliament would be legislating because of a fear of what an abuser might do, almost not doing what's right for fear of how an abuser might react, which is surely the wrong end of the telescope? But secondly, if that's right, how might this bill be adjusted to address that possibility such that it achieves its aims without risk to families?
So, putting the definitions and legalities and hypothetical in terms of guilty pleas and not guilty pleas aside, we think that in a way the notification or registration requirement being placed before the assessment requirement is back to front, and that arguably it needs to be more nuanced, and that the assessment should dictate whether or not somebody is required to register and be subject to notification requirements. And that assessment needs to be carried out on a case-by-case individualised basis with a focus on the circumstances of the offence, the circumstances of the offender, and the circumstances of their broad network, including, and perhaps even especially, their family. So it might be that in some of those cases, registration is entirely appropriate and necessary and proportionate and helpful. It might be that in others that it's not. So to impose a mandatory requirement could be problematic, but to have it available to the court to impose a discretionary requirement could be helpful. So for instance, at the moment, we have community payback orders. 9 requirements could be attached to a community payback order, ranging from supervision to unpaid work to programmes to substance use treatment. it seems feasible that an additional requirement could be added to that list of 9 that specifically focus on domestic abuse perpetrators and involves them needing to register or notify.
I understand. Thank you. Convener.
Okay, thank you. Katie Clark, followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. And I'd like to ask some questions about Part 2 of the bill, the assessment of offenders for rehabilitation programmes and services. And Glyn Lloyd has already referred to the lack of availability of programmes. So does the panel think there are gaps in the current processes of assessment for suitability for rehabilitation programmes and services that take place at court and whilst in custody and prior to release from prison, that Part 2 of the bill would address? I don't know if there's any of the witnesses that would want to come in on Part 2 of the bill. Glyn?
So, in terms of the Caledonian programme, obviously restricted to a small cohort that meet certain criteria. And until recently, the landscape across Scotland involved individual local authorities applying to Scottish Government for funding to deliver the programme. And the funding was based on those individual bids. More recently, in an effort to roll out the Caledonia programme, make it consistently available, or as consistently available as possible across Scotland, Scottish Government changed the approach, moved away from an individualised bid arrangement to increase the funding, the quantum funding, and apply a standard funding formula across the 32 local authorities. Funding formula involves cleared up crime, CPOs as a proportion of the population and rurality, and there is a correlation between that and the number of domestic abuse incidents. But there's not a complete correlation, so there are already questions there about whether or not the new approach provides enough capacity to deliver the Caledonia programme. And we're in the middle, or at the start, rather, of testing that and escalating that if necessary. Beyond that, and moving away from the Caledonia programme, there are no other accredited programmes available for people that don't meet that criteria. So that's the gap, and that's part of the attrition rate that I alluded to earlier on. If somebody subject to a CPO without a programme requirement, without a Caledonian requirement, but is a perpetrator of domestic abuse at present, needs an intervention, then that intervention is very much designed on a local authority, case-by-case, individual basis, and there is no consistency in that regard across the 32 local authorities.
Yes, thank you.
This is not speaking on behalf of the Criminal Law Committee, but as ex-chair of the Scottish Advisory Panel on Offender Rehabilitation, and also as a person who is currently running a trial of a new programme in justice with the support of Justice Social Work in Scotland and probation in England and Wales. There's a gap in terms of provision, and we've known that for years. So we a group of us over the past 15 years have developed an intervention, which is a shorter intervention, but to address some of that gap, which is perpetrators who use substance use, and it's been trialled in Scotland. Scottish Government are supportive of those new developments, and I think there's moves towards addressing that gap. It's not there yet. And we will be applying for the SAPOR accreditation as well. So there are moves to address that, but I would absolutely heartily endorse the fact that we don't have a great deal of kite-marked provision at the moment to address the needs in Scotland, and we need it. So it's not the assessment, it's the availability of intervention.
Yes. Would either of the other witnesses want to come in? I mean, obviously, it would be helpful to know how significant the gap of availability is. An assessment of to what extent that rehabilitation is actually available. Not just for in specified criteria, but where actually it should really be ideally there. Okay.
I think if you look at the Caledonian evaluation, the latest one, I think of the number of people which was in the 500s that came through in terms of reports, etc. There was only like 59 at the end in terms of evaluations that they've managed to follow up in the research. So it's really difficult to know what the attrition rate for the Caledonian is. In terms of people meeting the criteria for the Caledonian, which are stringent and high and required, there's a great attrition at that point. So there's a huge gap because people don't have time on their sentence. They're given different sentences. They're sent to prison, and SPS, Scottish Prison Service, at the moment do not have a programme that addresses IPV specifically. They do have programmes that will address some of the criminogenic need behind that. It's difficult to quantify the gap, though. A great deal of resource. I think everybody would be happy to see more resource going towards this.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask a question about the financial memorandum relating to this part of the bill, because Pam Gosel, the member in charge of the bill, has told the committee she believes there would be sufficient capacity in the system in terms of Part 2 of the bill if the obligations set out in the financial memorandum were met. What are your views on this? I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at it in detail. And for example, are the finances the only issue, or is it to do with recruitment of you know, whether we actually have people available that would be able to carry out these functions? Is that something that any of the panel have looked at, the costings round about some of these proposals? I don't know if Glenn would like to come in on that.
We didn't specifically. There would be resource implications, though, and it is difficult to quantify that. But to try and illustrate the figures I quoted earlier on, in Dundee, for instance, in a given year, 376 court reports with a domestic abuse marker, 59 result in a Caledonia programme, so 317 didn't. If that 317 needed some form of rehabilitation programme, then that would have significant resource implications, depending on what that rehabilitation programme looked like. And then we would need to cost that, but that's not something I've immediately available in terms of detail.
And I mean, are there any non-legislative changes that could be made to improve opportunities for and successive rehabilitation programmes and services for domestic abuse survivors? Obviously, this is a legislative mechanism. Do you think we need a legislative mechanism for this? Quite often, this Parliament thinks legislation helps drive change that actually could happen without legislation. But this is a way of trying to ensure it happens. So I don't know if the panel have any comments on that, whether we need legislation.
But this is, again, my view, not necessarily the Law Society's view, because I don't think the Law Society would talk about resource. But it would be that if legislation were to then bring resource to the focus, then that would be helpful. So if there were a positive requirement for intervention to be provided that then led to resource following, I think that would be helpful. So things like the DAPO in England and a positive requirement for a range of different interventions and those interventions being funded, that would be helpful. But it's probably not the only way of doing it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Rona Mackay, followed by Jenny Hepburn.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. There's been a lot covered so far, so I'm good. My questions will be pretty broad brush, just to sort of clarify some of the points already raised. I mean, one of my questions would have been, do you think this register would act as a deterrent? And I'm picking up from most of you don't think it would be a deterrent to offenders. I just wanted to sort of clarify that. Professor Gilchrist, you said you weren't against the bill as such, but you are concerned about the practicalities involved. Do you think that those are issues that could be resolved should the bill get to stage 2 by amendment? The practicalities of it. I know it's a hard one to answer.
It's a very broad question in terms of the practicalities. I think a bill obviously could be enacted, and if definitions were refined, if resources were to follow, then absolutely that could be the case. It feels, though, as if there's a huge amount of resource that would be needed to enact this bill appropriately and effectively, and that if we are going to be pushed for money, because we do not have unlimited resource, it doesn't feel as if the enactment of the register is necessarily the best place to focus those resources.
Sure.
I think identifying the gap in terms of provision of behaviour change is maybe a more effective place to sort of focus resource.
Thank you. Thank you. One of our witnesses last week, their view was that this was really an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy Is that something that anyone could identify with when you're thinking about this bill? Glyn, would you like to?
Only to add to and perhaps emphasise what's already been said, is that sledgehammers and nuts spring to mind, and we perhaps need a more nuanced approach that makes better use of the available resource in a way that targets it proportionately at different types and levels of risk. Not confident that the bill in its current format helps us to do that.
Thank you. Do you want to comment, Detective?
Are we still talking about part 2 or about the bill in its entirety?
Part 1, actually, I'm talking about, yeah.
Part 1 absolutely would introduce another heavy layer of bureaucracy. And, I discussed earlier on that the complexities of layering that with existing processes, duplication of effort, overlap of responsibilities would all be concerned, and very, very challenging to implement that in a coherent way without unintended consequences.
Thank you. And from the Crown's point of view?
I'm not sure that we've seen the evidence that this will deter, and perhaps if that evidence was available, then our evidence might shift a little. But because the police target the most high-risk offenders and work to protect the most at-risk victims, that as a model is effective. And we've seen, well, the official crime statistics have just been published. We've seen that the number of Section 1 Domestic Abuse Scotland Act prosecutions has gone up by 19%. Now, that might not sound like we're deterring, but actually it does, because it means that we're prosecuting more offences that reflect lived experience, that we're managing to prosecute the totality of someone's experience and tell their whole story to the court. And when we prosecute Domestic Abuse Scotland Act, we have an 86% conviction rate. So that's the work of the Domestic Abuse Task Force, the higher tier of policing and that specialist approach, and that's what deters, to my mind, as a prosecutor.
Just one other point I want to raise, and that was the witness last week from Shakti, Women's Aid, had raised the point about unintended consequences and the fact that perhaps a woman who was defending themselves, well, any woman defending themselves, could end up being on this register, if they had, had to fight back, as it were. Is that something that you recognise? Is that? Would you think that's a danger of having a register like this? Emma?
So, to explain how that happens, we have a joint protocol with Police Scotland, and we have had since 2004 in various iterations. And there's quite clear guidance to police officers on how to deal with dual reporting. So where both parties in a relationship report criminality at the same time. And in that situation, the police role, which is difficult, is to identify the primary perpetrator. So if there has been retaliation and for self-defence or protection, let's assume for this case scenario that we have a man and a woman, it wouldn't always be. But then that woman should not be prosecuted, and that there shouldn't be a report. And we don't see very many of them. What's much more difficult is the scenario where somebody is living with domestic abuse over a long period of time and just finally, through fear or whatever other motivation, in some way violently resists and commits an offence. If it's a very serious offence and there's significant injury, the police will report that to the prosecutor, and we do have a presumption in favour of prosecution. Those are the kinds of cases that we very few of our domestic abuse cases don't go to court for prosecution. Very few are diverted. Those are the cases that would be more likely to be diverted. But if we had a scenario where the offending was so significant and serious that we prosecuted in the public interest and that person was convicted, then they would find themselves on this register.
So that would be a loophole, albeit rare. It would be a loophole that would be there with the register.
So this is where the risk management and trying to prevent that from happening. We can't prevent domestic abuse in the first place, but we can disrupt it, and we want to try and prevent those scenarios.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you. I've got a heavy cold today. I have a few questions for the panel predicating some of the specific evidence that you provide in the written form. So some of the questions will be specific to specific witnesses. And the first is for Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and it's in the area of data collection and reporting. In your very helpful submission, you set out that you're concerned that the provisions in the bill provide for a victim of domestic abuse potentially being asked for the same comprehensive personal data multiple times. Could you expand that a little further and set out why that might be a concern?
Yes, so thank you for the question. If each member of this committee asks the panel a different, we come along and you all ask us a different question. If we came in and each of you asked the same question, it would have the effect of starting to feel like you weren't being believed. I would start to think, I've already answered this question, why are you asking again? So the impact of we know that the impact of asking a victim of crime the same question over and over again is that it compounds their feeling of not being believed and makes it very difficult for them to engage with the criminal justice process. This data collection is going to be at quite an early stage of the process. And although we absolutely recognise the need for more data to be collected. We want to collect better data. In fact, in England and Wales, they don't even aggregate domestic abuse and stalking statistics annually the way that we do, and have commended Scotland for their approach. We still know we could be better, and this is helpful data to have. But I would suggest that there's a way of perhaps doing this through the work of the Victim Task Force to ensure that there's a coordinated collection of data rather than imposing a legislative duty on every separate agency, because I fear for the re-traumatisation in asking victims the same questions over and over.
So effectively, what you're saying there would be another way of collecting this data without a statutory requirement for victims to be repeatedly asked to provide details?
Yes, so the Scottish Government runs the Victim Task Force. It's co-chaired by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and the Lord Advocate. It meets twice a year and has wide representation across the sector. And one of the working groups within that task force is a victim-centred approach committee, and a report submitted to the task force by them has advocated for a single point of contact within each organisation for victims and a single front door. So there's a digital piece of work ongoing to ensure that every agency would use the same language on their website, would have the same description of the court process, the same explanation, the same answers to questions, and also a victim's passport, so that when they've given certain information to one agency, it would be shared with other agencies appropriately, so that stories are not being repeated, because we know all evidence shows that that's re-traumatising.
Okay. And sticking on data collection and reporting, for this question for Professor Gilchrist in relation to the Law Society's written evidence, you set out you have some concerns regarding the proposal. Maybe you can respond more widely in terms of what those concerns might be, but I do notice that you say specifically that as an organisation you wonder whether it would be more useful to analyse data regarding the offence itself rather than the complainer's characteristics. Perhaps you could say a bit more about that.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose it's the reason for collecting the data. As a researcher, I'd be saying that we wouldn't collect data unless we were clear as to the purpose, as to why. At the moment, the way we do risk assessment in justice social work, they use a tool which looks at the offence characteristics. So what's the nature of the offending, what the perpetrator characteristics are, so what are the deficits or issues or criminogenic need in the perpetrators that may have contributed to the offences being enacted, and they look at victim vulnerabilities. So that information is already there within the risk assessments. To the Law Society and perhaps also to myself, the point would be that if we're trying to identify the nature, when things happen, what the highest risks are, what we can do to intervene and reduce the risk of reperpetration, then that's probably more helpful than focusing solely on supporting or looking at the needs of the victim. That is not to say that the victim needs are not critical and crucial. And if we have a sense that there are victims from different backgrounds or with different vulnerabilities whose needs are not being met, then that's something that we should be able to address. But to me, if the focus is about reducing the risk of offending and reoffending, then it's the nature of the offending and the offender that we need to look at.
That's helpful. Just turning to issues around resources, Katie Clark asked you this question released part 2 of the bill, but there's also issues raised around part 3, and some of the written evidence the Crown Office says it was concerned that the bill's financial memorandum suggests that implementation of this part would be low and met within existing budgets, but you go on to say, given the range of data to be collected and the interface with your systems, implementation is likely to require significant system updates with corresponding resource implications. I don't know if you could say a bit more about that, if there's been any assessment as to what that might likely constitute or what the implications would be for you as an organisation. And again, Police Scotland also say something similar. You say you are generally supportive of the principles of Part 3, but it would require Police Scotland to develop training mechanisms to ensure that the relevant data was collected appropriate said to be, along with updates to internal systems to ensure that data is recorded and reported accurately. So I guess I suppose it's a similar question for Detective Superintendent Brown in relation to his written evidence, but perhaps could go with the Crown Office first.
So I confess we haven't done precise costings of how much this would cost, but given the significant commitment that it would involve, whilst we support it, we recognise that it would involve additional resource, and we were concerned that our systems at the moment would not allow us to easily capture that data, and therefore if there are system upgrades we would need to go to our IT department and ask them to cost that.
For the be quite significant though, the cost that is?
If it involves technology updates, then yes.
Okay.
If it's absorbed within the current if it's within the current system, it might not be absorbable, but it would not be such a significant cost. We wouldn't know until we sort of tried to troubleshoot it and work it out.
Test Superintendent Brown.
Same response really. So we haven't done the exact costings. It certainly wouldn't be as significant as Part 1. We're perhaps in a slightly more advantageous position that a lot of our systems have been upgraded as we've evolved as one organisation from 8 10 years ago. So I can't comment specifically on the cost. There would inevitably be a cost involved around the IT element of it, but there would also be a degree of cost involved in how we guide and train officers and ensure that they're asking those questions in a sensitive way, because that's very important to this as well, because when people call the police to talk about the character of the relationships, it's often an acute moment of crisis, and they may not always be in the mindset that they want to answer personal questions and may just want to talk more with the police about why they've called in the first place. So we need to be cautious around how we ask some of those questions, and I think we need to acknowledge that sometimes they may not want to answer them. So even with the right intention, that data won't always be 100% complete and accurate.
I mean, that actually sounds as though it could be quite an extensive process for Police Scotland.
I think we'd have to do the costings and more analysis on that and come back to you. It's complex, and it's probably out with my expertise to comment specifically just now.
Okay, thanks. And just one final question, if I may. Convener, and it relates to the element around education in schools, and it's the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service evidence. It's about the right to withdraw pupils from it and from any education. But you suggest there could be implications for UNCRC in relation to that. I just found that an interesting observation. I don't know if you can say any more on that.
Part is not really for the Crown, but we just made the observation because the Scottish Parliament has recently embedded the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, and we all have an obligation in relation to that. And the bar that is set by that convention is that we always have in mind the best interests of the child. And if you are a child living in a household with domestic abuse, then hearing a class discussion about the dynamics of offending could be re-traumatising and not in that child's best interest. And so that would need to be carefully managed. But the question, I suppose, would then be who's going to manage that? Is the teacher going to manage it? That means they would need to know that it was ongoing. Is mum going to manage it? So for mum to have the child's best interests and disclose that to the school, that means that mum is disclosing to the school and to an authority that there's domestic abuse at home, which she may not be ready to do and may not have done. Or is dad going to do it if he's, and sorry, and I have taken the sort of male film, that's not to say that it's every case, it's just, you know, easier for a scenario. But then if the perpetrator of the abuse is going to withdraw the child from the class to prevent the child hearing the lesson, then that's certainly not in the child's best interest. But, you know, that's obviously another way of controlling. And then if a parent does decide to withdraw their child from the class and doesn't give a reason, then that begs the question, what's in that child's best interest and what's going on at home? And so it's a bit of a Pandora's box. Absolutely, education is so important, but I think that the committee would want to make sure that if schools are going to be under a legislative duty, that their UNCRC obligations were considered in that, and also just to recognise where it might sit with the excellent work of Equally Safe in relation to education, which takes a broader look at educating around gender and intersectional inequalities rather than just specifically one kind of offending.
Do you get the sense then that issue around compliance with the UNCRC hasn't been given enough thought at this stage?
I didn't see that it was addressed in the policy memorandum, I have to say.
That's helpful. I know you didn't cite it, Professor Gilchrist, but I could see you nodding along there, so maybe you have an observation in this area as well.
The Criminal Law Committee doesn't have a view on this. But as a psychologist, then I would very much echo. I was listening to something about how to incorporate the rights of the child into the adult criminal courts last week in the Sheriff Court, and absolutely think that this is something we really need to think about, the rights of the child. I think it would have to be education really safe. It would have to be trauma informed. We are trauma informed in Scotland. And I think we would have to consider it similarly to Safe Touch or something like that, so that you're looking at positive requirements of positive relationships, but think about how and why people would be removed from this. Because I would worry that the people that are highest risk, for whatever reason, but echoing what the Fiscal has said, would be the people who wouldn't hear the lessons.
So just to round that off, I'm presuming the answer to this is yes, but correct me if I'm not. If you don't feel it's been given due consideration, do you consider then there's a possibility that the bill as drafted could fall foul of what we've legislated for in terms of compliance with the UNCRC?
I think if that's part of the bill is going to go any further, then it needs consideration of the rights of the child, their best interests and the UNCRC implications, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if I can maybe just come in on a bit of that with regard to the well-being of children that are caught up in domestic abuse. And I was just thinking when Jamie Hepburn was asking his questions, looking at parts 1 and 2, I think it came out earlier probably in our lines of questioning that probably both those parts of the bill have the potential to impose a sort of additional layer of bureaucracy, if you like, that some may view could be better used elsewhere to, in this sort of overall effort to tackle violence against women and girls. But not only would that sort of level or that layer of bureaucracy potentially be placed on services and organisations, but also potentially on families and children indirectly. So I'm thinking about families where children are already grappling with getting through daily life and the potential for registration or attending or participating in the assessment process for rehabilitation, these are all things that families have to kind of negotiate and insert into their daily lives at a time when life can be quite difficult already. So I'm interested in any of the witnesses' views on, to what extent the burden of what we're trying to achieve via the bill, the provisions of the bill, particularly in parts 1 and 2, potentially that can actually have unintended negative consequences on families and victims and particularly children's well-being. So, Glyn, I don't know if you want to come in on that from social work point of view.
So I think we would say that in its current form, it is too heavy, too crude, and emphasise some of the nuances that I think we've all alluded to throughout this session. I think it's also important to emphasise existing arrangements in terms of GERFEC, named persons, team around the child arrangements, child protection arrangements, safe and together. All of that is already in place for families experiencing domestic abuse, obviously including especially children. So I think that's important to emphasise. I think in terms of children that are perpetrators of domestic abuse, that's another question that we need to examine, and possibly need to look at this in the context of the Care and Justice Act as well, for 16 and 17-year-olds who would no longer be prosecuted in court but processed via the hearing system, and whether or not there are any complications or complexities in that regard in terms of the interface between the bill and that legislation, I think warrants some exploration.
Okay, thank you for that. Detective Superintendent Brown, have you got any views on that?
I think it's well articulated there and by yourself, Convener. This is, at the best of times, a confusing, frightening and complex situation to be in for a victim. The processes we've already spoken about don't work in isolation from child protection processes, adult support and protection processes, and that's before we get to the criminal justice process itself and the prospect of going through court. I suppose one thing we've not really discussed is we've discussed the management of offenders, and effectively the point of this is to keep them in line, but there will be incidences where they step out of line, and we then need to consider the impact of that on victims as well, and children and families, because a lot of the time information that they've breached notification requirements may come from victims and families, and then there'll be an additional prospect of the criminal justice process in addition to all those other things. So I think the reality is it will be another complexity and will sort of a very, very complex situation for families.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's kind of what I was getting at in my question. Professor Gilchrist or Emma Forbes, would you like to come in on that at all with any comments?
This is just picking up on evidence that was given in the Sheriff Court last week by Professor Nancy Looks, that in terms of the impact on the child, that potentially we should be having a positive assessment, a positive requirement for a child impact assessment in anything we're doing. And I think that might be something we'd need to think of.
Thank you. And Emma Forbes.
I would really just echo what others have said. It's already very difficult to meaningfully take the views of a child in a criminal process and to ensure that they're not lost and forgotten about. And that's something that we struggle with and try to improve our approach daily. But also we are concerned about children who come into conflict with the law, which is what's just been referenced as well in relation to the age of childhood moving from 16 to 18, and the fact that since COVID we have seen, sadly, a rise in the number of reports for domestic and sexual offending in that 16, 17 and 18-year-old age group. And we're worried about it, but there has been an increase, and there is, of course, a risk with a register of quite significant stigma at a very young age.
Thank you for that. Okay, Pauline McNeill, I don't know if you want to come in with any other questions beyond the supplementaries that you asked earlier. If not, I'll open up to any members for final questions. We've got a wee bit of time in hand, and if not, I'll bring in Pam Gosel.
I think it's largely been covered.
Okay, thank you. In that case, Pam Gosel.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I've got a couple of questions, and the first question is to yourself, Adam. Adam, thank you for coming here today. I remember in our meeting in August, you indicated that you wanted to provide evidence to the Criminal Justice Committee, so it's good to see you here. In the same meeting, I recall your colleague DCS, Sarah Taylor, say that this bill would be groundbreaking. She also mentioned that having the details in the register in relation to especially the perpetrator's address at the time would be very helpful, because especially when we've heard that the police have to go out looking for this perpetrator where they are, but there are a lot of information you don't have and this register would have. Similarly, the Scottish Police Federation signalled their support for the bill if provided with the proper resources. Domestic abuse is costing the public sector billions of pounds each year, and obviously the force has been underfunded by the Scottish Government for years. So do you agree with the Scottish Police Federation, and do you believe that with proper resources this bill could work? And how, with your expertise, can we make the bill work and bring down bureaucracy at stage 2?
Quite a lot to unpick, I would suggest, in that question. I don't agree necessarily that even with sufficient funding and resources that we know enough about how the bill may operate that I could say that we could make it work. If I was to be 100% honest, I don't think it's going to work. I think for all the reasons I've outlined, and I don't dispute the other concerns that have been raised in respect of other unintended consequences that I haven't personally referenced. So in that respect, the answer would be no. In terms of, just repeat the second part of the question for me. As I say, quite a bit to unpick.
It's basically saying that what DCS Sarah Taylor said as well, that on the same meeting you were at as well, it's groundbreaking in the fact that you'll have more information on the perpetrator than you normally do have.
So I absolutely acknowledged already in this committee that there may be some potential benefits. I referenced that potential amendment around changing relationship status could lead us on to a disclosure. So it's not to dispute or deny any potential benefits to Part 1, but we just don't know enough about the extent of those benefits, what they bring in addition to what we've already got, and whether they'd be proportionate to the significant cost. And I think that's where the concerns lie.
Okay, no, thank you. Just some other questions for the other panel. Thank you for all responding to the call of views and for coming here today. It's very interesting to listen to the feedback, as this does help us MSPs to make better legislation. So it's really been helpful, all the feedback you've given today. While putting together this bill, I have consulted with many survivors who believe that current system is simply not working and that perpetrators are simply let out with a slap on the wrist and are allowed to reoffend. And we know how high reoffending is when we look at the statistics that we get. That's more than half of reported cases. Domestic abuse is costing the public purse £7.5 billion in a 3-year period, while the bill is estimated to cost around £23 million, which is less than 0.5% of the justice budget. So don't you believe that in the long term, this bill could help save money? And what changes would you see to bring forward at stage 2? So if I could start with yourself, Emma.
So I think given the questions that we've all raised about the financial memorandum, I'm not sure that this... So firstly, I think that you said that that domestic abuse costs the Scottish Society £7 billion over a 3-year period. I think the research I read suggests that it costs that annually. So I think that the costs like what the cost of domestic abuse to society is significant. I think you've actually underplayed that cost. And in relation to what the bill would cost, I think that's been underplayed as well, because we haven't factored in quite a lot of costs about the mechanics of how things would work, which we've all given evidence on. So, of course, such a small percentage of the criminal justice budget to prevent or deter domestic abuse would be a positive. I just don't think that we've seen the evidence base that the provisions within the bill would deter and prevent in the way that. So we only just have the MARAC in every local authority area. Is that we do now, don't we? Yes, yes. But that's relatively recent. It's taken over 20 years to get there. It's been patchy. We still don't have national advocacy provision to support victims' engagement through the process everywhere. That's still patchy. And we don't have the Caledonian programme available to every sheriff in every court in Scotland. So I think that if we had that money available, it would be to enhance and reinforce the multi-agency partnership working that we have at the moment, that we know targets the highest risk offenders and the most at-risk victims. But that's...
Thank you. And yourself, Liz? Yeah, good morning. I think on behalf of the Criminal Law Committee, I think there's an absolute support for doing something to address the issues around domestic abuse, and to put more resource would be absolutely really supported. I think the unintended or potential unintended consequences of registration are the ones I'd want to highlight: the potential guilty pleas, the people going underground, and that vast resource tracking the lower risk individuals, variable risk but lower risk. Personally, I would like to see the resources go into making the systems we already have in place work better, the development of more interventions and funding of those behaviour change programmes. I think we would fully support education, early on, to address some of the issues about positive relations and relating, and better use of the data we already have. So it's more enhancing the systems that are there and making the provisions to change behaviours for perpetrators more available across Scotland. So much of what you're suggesting, absolutely, but just potentially not in the same way.
And yourself?
I agree, or certainly similar. I think that there need to be tools to help us to manage and assess risk. But they need to be used proportionately and forensically and targeted in the right way on the right people. And in terms of the bill, I think the assessment of the offender and of the offence and of the circumstances should be front and centre. And that in terms of any registration and notification requirements, that should be discretionary rather than mandatory, based on the level and type of risk. And in that context, in terms of new legislation and bureaucracy, potentially at least there's an opportunity to refine existing arrangements in terms of the legislation that created community payback orders, by adding another condition, for instance, to community payback orders, where there are already 9. On rehabilitation, I think there are gaps and inconsistencies and resource issues. And on victim support, again, I think there are gaps, inconsistencies and resource issues.
Thank you. Thank you.
Polly McNeill, I think you want to come back in, and then I've got a couple of final questions too.
Thank you. Professor Liz-Gilchrist, I thought maybe you might be able to answer this question. On the effectiveness of rehabilitation and programmes, presumably, I'm presuming that if you make it mandatory, it's not going to work for everyone. Is there a certain element to which it's important for the person to agree that they want to go on that journey? And just anything at all you can tell us about how effective it can be and who might be
International evidence says that all programmes have a small positive effect. So well-managed programmes delivered by well-trained staff who are supervised well, that focus on criminogenic need, are well received, and they have a small positive effect. They don't, it's not a magic wand, though. International evidence at the moment says that the most effective programmes are CBT-based, that they have a motivational element to it. So we're not expecting people, whether they come as non-mandated, voluntold to attend or volunteered or quote-mandated, they have to have a motivational component. You need to work with the offender and also in the context of risk. So well-delivered programmes, so the Caledonian system is a well-thought-through programme. It requires quite a high level of motivation at the beginning, so people have to agree to take part in this before the assessments are made and before that suggestion comes forward in the pre-sentence reports at court. There are other programmes that are shorter, that don't require the same level of motivation, that could be effective. And yeah, I think there is hope that we can hold people accountable, we can help them change behaviours, and we can reduce the risk. One of the biggest things we haven't got at the moment, but the ongoing research we're doing is looking at longer-term follow-ups and follow-up in routine data to see if interventions actually have the impact of changing behaviour, so people don't come through in health and they don't come through in justice data. We're working with Police Scotland and they are supporting this research so that we're looking at following up using data safe havens to actually see whether or not particular interventions at the moment being conducted in Scotland in 2 years' time have the impact of changing the outcomes in terms of justice call-outs and such like. And that kind of information is really, really important to collect.
No, thank you. That's really helpful to know that and have that on the record. And we just finally, Dr. Emma Forbes, can I just ask you what you said to the committee a while ago about concern around 16 and 17-year-olds? I think you said that about offending behaviour of 16 and 17-year-olds. And I just wondered, we had some exchanges last week with the panel and the committee are interested in this whole area. Obviously, the Parliament's interested in this whole area. Obviously, about what is the right focus in education. And it would just be an opinion. I'd just be interested to know, given your experience, if that's the case, if we are seeing higher levels of offending behaviour between 16 and 17-year-olds in this area of law. You've got any views about what do we need to do? Is it tackle boys' attitudes rather than teach them about domestic abuse? Just anything at all that you want to do.
So we don't. I personally don't know why there's been a spike. We've seen, within Crown Office, we've seen an increase in the reports of 16 and 17-year-olds for sexual offending and also for domestic abuse. But we also know that our colleagues at Assist have dedicated advocacy workers for children and young people, and they're supporting more 16 and 17-year-olds than they ever have before, and that's reported in their bulletin. So we know that there's been an increase, and it seems to have been since COVID. So I hesitate to say much more than this because... Okay. But I suppose I think that the Women's Support Project has said in their evidence to this committee, either for this bill or for the prostitution bill, but recently at least, that they believe that it's because of access to pornography online, especially during lockdown when where there was less peer influence, less parental influence and more online influence. So that might be something. Yep. But I'm not entirely sure. But also in relation to the perpetrator programmes that you asked about a minute ago, yep. Professor Amanda Robinson at Cardiff University has done some really good research on perpetrator programmes. She's just recently published on 3 new initiatives that she's evaluated. And she's part of the reason that we have MARAC in Scotland. So her work is definitely, I would commend it to the committee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gosh.
Operation, that it was a good suggestion.
Thank you.
Professor Gilchrist, did you want to come in at all? No?
The only thing I was going to say is that there's a dearth of information and research on dating violence, and there's a recognition that you can't just translate adult models to young people. Mm-hmm. There's some question mark around exploration in terms of sexual misbehaviours in adolescence, but there's a real big question mark about whether the current psychoeducational models in schools is enough. And that's all I can say is we kind of know we don't know. So there's a need to find out more.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder if I can maybe just, we're just kind of up at time, but there's a couple of things I was wondering if I could just come back in on. And just in our previous sort of line of questioning, we're talking about existing practice and arrangements. I think it was yourself, Emma Forbes, that spoke about how long it can take for processes and arrangements to roll out, so such as MARAC. I remember years ago when it was first being introduced in Scotland, and it feels like a lifetime ago. I'm interested in perhaps coming back to Detective Superintendent Brown and maybe Glyn Lloyd with particular reference to the disclosure scheme, and whether you think that any of the provisions in the bill would change how decisions are made around disclosure, or perhaps what would be disclosed. So do you think perhaps that there's sufficient awareness of the disclosure scheme? So I don't think that we teased that out in earlier questioning. So any comments that you have on that would be helpful.
The disclosure scheme grows every year. It has done since its inception. So obviously we're publicised in October when it reached its 10-year anniversary that amounted to 20,000 disclosures over that decade. What that means in reality, breaking it down, is that we're talking about receiving 20 applications a day, around 600 applications a month that we're processing, which typically marks a 20-odd% increase every year on average over the last few years. The biggest increase in that in the last couple of years has been through the right to ask pathway. So that's the pathway through which members of the public, whether it's people in relationships themselves or concerned family members or colleagues, can make applications to the scheme. So from our perspective, we feel that our efforts around publication of the scheme, awareness raising both internally and with our partner agencies is driving that. But we are working with stakeholders currently, including representatives from the Scottish Government, to look at improving the reach of the scheme and how we might better particularly reach seldom heard communities. So there's always room for improvement. In terms of the bill and its impact on the scheme, it probably won't make a great deal of difference to what we disclose or how we disclose it, because as with the other processes I referenced, it's not based on convictions. Convictions obviously play an important part, but the wider narrative of a perpetrator's character also plays a part in the disclosure scheme, and that's one of its strengths.
Okay, thank you for that. Glyn Lloyd, nothing more to add on that. Thank you. Just one final question, and again, it maybe did come out in some of your earlier responses. If so, I apologise, probably missed it. It's with relation to MAPA. Now, obviously, the committee's heard evidence that MAPA, and we know that that was not designed for domestic abuse, use with domestic abuse offenders. So, I mean, I'll maybe come back again to Detective Superintendent Brown and Glyn Lloyd. From your experience, would the system work to assess, sort of manage domestic abuse offenders as defined in the bill, in the context of MAPA being for a specific group of offenders, as it were? So I'll come to Adam Brown first.
Not without significant research and development of training, and I mean significant. In my opinion, having policed extensively in domestic abuse and on a more limited basis in the MAPA framework, I think we're talking about creating a new discipline within policing, so that a domestic abuse lens is applied effectively to offender management practices. And I know in correspondence with Pam, she referenced expanding the cohort of offenders who come under MAPA. I think it's far more complex than that in terms of how we train officers. We're dealing about, I'm not a forensic psychologist, but MAPA is designed to deal with sex offenders predominantly. And we're talking about offenders whose motivations and actions are different when we talk about coercive and controlling behaviour. Something very, very different. And the management techniques would need to change and adapt.
So really that would have to be very sort of robustly evidence-based.
Absolutely.
Glyn Lloyd, do you want to come in with anything on that?
Same. I think MAPA could potentially be used as a framework, but provided it's focused on the right perpetrators of domestic abuse and provided the people around the table have the right level of knowledge and skills to understand, assess and manage risk. And I'm also conscious that the landscape is very, very complicated. We've referenced today MARAC, MATAC, MAPA, Team Around the Child. There are multiple multi-agency assessment and planning meetings, and if we can, as far as possible, without increasing risk, it would, I think, be helpful to streamline that and make that more understandable, not just to practitioners, but also, I think, to perpetrators and victims.
Yeah. Would you agree that there would be quite significant implications for operational officers and staff who would have to inform that process? That's certainly a concern that I would have. You know, it's again another new responsibility that ultimately, to a certain extent, would be drawn away from frontline responses. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, so we'd have to create 13 new teams, in my opinion, across Scotland. They would have to be recruited from either the front line or other detective disciplines, but the impact ultimately would be felt on frontline resources down the chain, depending on how we recruited. And because of the responsibilities and the statutory responsibilities, often those teams are ring-fenced from support and other operational duties, whereas with other specialisms we may have a flexibility to have detectives go out and support the policing of events, football matches and that sort of thing. Our vendor management teams are typically more ring-fenced because of the heavy responsibilities that they carry. So it would have an impact on frontline.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we're just over time, so we'll draw the session to a close. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Some very helpful points pulled out from our questions. So we'll thank you again, and we'll just have a short suspension before we move into private session. Thank you.